Welcome to the Watchman Report, world news from a biblical standpoint, the biblical standard on current events, on prophecy, moral and social issues. And in this episode, we explore why Russia wins and Iran survives.
Well, hello everybody and welcome to the channel. I'm going to have a little quick presentation to show you, and it's very much about what's going on in the world, but looking at it from a Bible point of view. So, as you can see on the image in front of you, we have a situation in the world at the moment where we have numerous leaders who claim they're going to do certain things and then find out later on what actually happens. So the title of this little presentation here is Bible Declassified: Why Russia Wins and Iran Survives. These world leaders make their plans and make their great speeches based on what they think they're going to do. However, one thing that they don't take into account is what the Bible says and what God has revealed about what is actually going to happen in the future according to his plan. The God of all creation, the God of heaven, has a plan for planet Earth, and over a very long period of time, he is gradually moving his plan forward, piece by piece, here and there, every few years, every few decades, every few centuries, towards his ultimate objective. So we're going to find out a little bit about how things are progressing. So, first of all, a reminder of a couple of things that have happened in recent years. Today's the 23rd of June, 2026, and it's the 10-year anniversary of the British vote to leave the European Union. Let's remind ourselves of a couple of things that they said would never happen. There was a deputy prime minister a few years ago in Britain by the name of Mr. Nick Clegg, and he said the UK is not going to leave the European Union. Of course not. We are inextricably wound up with Europe in terms of culture, history and geography. We are a European nation, and he was one of many voices who said it was impossible that Britain would leave the European Union. Well, are you sure about that, Mr. Clegg? Are you sure about that, all of you people who think that Britain will remain in Europe and would be mad to leave it? Well, what happened? Britain voted to leave. The idea was politically impossible for many of the post-war years. But this was a seismic event. It was a political earthquake. And I've put there the front cover of the Times showing us that it was called the Brexit earthquake. And it led to the demise of the then Prime Minister, Mr. David Cameron. And there have been many short-lived British Prime Ministers ever since, partly because they can't fix all the things that were opened when Britain voted to leave the European Union. So if you look at the Bible, Jesus actually talks about certain things to do with the times in which we live. In the Bible, they're called the last days. But Jesus prophesied about these times. And if you turn to Matthew chapter 24, he was asked a question by his disciples, as the third verse tells us in Matthew chapter 24. As they sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came unto him, Jesus, privately saying, Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of thy coming and of the end of the world? If you read the whole chapter, you'll find that Jesus has just said some things about the temple, the great symbol of Jewish pride at that time. But the disciples are asking him about when is the sign of your coming, because he'd spoken to them about how he was going to go and then come back again after his resurrection. And they didn't quite fully understand it at the time, the disciples, but they're asking him about it. They're trying to understand what he's talking about what's going to happen in the future regarding him. Verse 4 says, Jesus answered and said unto them, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And then he says this in verse 6, And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in diverse places. Doesn't that describe the times in which we're living right now, where there are numerous wars going on? This word earthquake that Jesus uses here in the original Greek language that the New Testament is written in, it's the word seismos. It's a seismic event. It's a shaking. So events are happening in the world which are literally shaking the world. And the wars going on right now, and Brexit 10 years ago, or the vote to leave 10 years ago, I should say, are certainly big seismic events. Okay, another one. Things they said would never happen. Now, there were numerous voices about 10 years ago with the American election coming up who said that Donald Trump was never going to be the Republican candidate. It was impossible. He was never going to be selected as the Republican candidate. It was impossible. He's never going to be successful in his campaign. It was impossible. He was not going to win the presidency. That was just out of the question. And many, many political voices around the world thought this was not going to happen, including an expert on political affairs, Mr. Clooney, who said there's not going to be a President Donald Trump at Cannes, at a press conference there. He said that. Well, what happened? Are you sure about that, Mr. Clooney? Let's see what happened. Well, as you all know, not only did Mr. Trump get elected in his first presidency, he was then out of office when President Biden got in, but he got back in to the presidency for a second time, this time with more power, with the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And this was after many political forces in the US tried everything they possibly could to stop this from happening. They tried to impeach him. They tried to imprison him. There's a mugshot there of him when they brought charges against him. Somebody even tried to shoot him. But like a Teflon frying pan, whatever was thrown at Mr. Trump seemed to slide off. He was elected for a second time. And look at the consequences since his election. I would argue to you, friends, that Brexit and Trump and a lot of other things that have happened in the world in recent years prove who is really in charge. It's not the voters. It's not the governments. There is a greater power moving things around in a different direction to the way the world wants things to go. And those of us who read our Bibles understand that it's Almighty God in heaven who is actually in control and making impossible things possible and making the things that he wants to happen, happen. So, 4 years ago, Mr. Putin in Russia, in the Kremlin, was advised by his generals that the special military operation that they were about to engage in would only last a short period of time, and that Ukraine would soon fall and Kiev would soon be under Russian control. From a Russian point of view, they believe that Kiev should always have been under Russian control, that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a plot by the West to destroy Russia. And it was only right and proper to their thinking that they should again retake Ukraine. So here we are, some 4 years later. The war is not going the way that the Kremlin thought it would go. There's been horrendous bloodshed and violence and death in that region for 4 years now, and still it seems to rumble on. But this war, as with others, are of course subject to God's control, not the control of the belligerents in the war itself. The way the war is going is proving really that Putin is not in control of the war itself. So who is? How is it working out the way it is when such great assurances were given to start with that it was only going to go one particular way? Well, that's not the only war that's not going the way that the leaders who engaged in its creation are finding out. We have the situation, of course, in Iran at the moment, which might be in the course of settling down a little. But recently, this year, towards the end of February, March time, the Americans and the Israelis launched military action against Iran. The leadership of Iran was decimated. The Ayatollah Khamenei was killed and was described as being dead in the rubble by the Telegraph headline there. And again, promises were made and thoughts were there at the beginning of the campaign of the war to explain the objectives. Remember this one. At the beginning of the war, Trump was calling on the Iranian people to rise up against their own government, against the Islamic regime. He said, help is on the way. He called on the people to take to the streets, to protest, to rise up against the government that they are currently under. And he said he was going to help them. So there was this very strong idea that American military intervention in Iran was going to lead to regime change. Well, how's that working out? It's not going the way the Americans and the Israelis were hoping. Are you sure about that, Mr. Trump? What were the consequences of this war? There are always unintended consequences to every war. But the result of this, as you can see on the screen in front of you, was a collapse in the global shipping trade. 20% of the world's energy supplies go through a little strip of water to the south of Iran called the Straits of Hormuz. There used to be around 100, 120 ships or thereabouts a day going through that waterway. It collapsed to literally one or two. It's gone up a little bit recently, but this has been a complete shock, another seismic event to the movement of energy supplies, oil, gas, but also, more crucially, fertilizers, urea, and other fertilizers, which are all manufactured in the region and shipped out only on boats. It's been a completely devastating set of consequences for the world as a consequence. It's led to fuel protests in Eastern Africa and in Ireland. It's led to diplomatic arguments and negotiations which are still ongoing. And it's not going the way everybody thought that it would do. I'm certain that you have found the price of fuel has shot up recently for those of you who drive cars. And the price of food has also gone up as a consequence, because 97% of all road transport is from hydrocarbon energy, from petrol and from diesel. And so the cost of shipping goods around has gone up. That means the price the customer has to pay has also significantly increased. So we've all felt the consequences of these military endeavors. But now at this stage, there's a deal been signed, apparently, between Iran and America. And Mr. Trump has said recently, ships of the world, start your engines, let the oil flow. He seems to think that this is the beginning of the end of the war and that this deal will lead to a normalization of things, prices going down, things getting back to normal. Really, Mr. Trump, are you sure about that? We're going to find out. From the Iranian side, apparently, the Iranian leadership were quoted recently as saying that the deal that's been signed provided assurances that Iran's rights and the interests of the resistance front will be protected. Really? Is that what's going to happen? You're going to find out. So time and time again, politicians make these great speeches, but it doesn't go the way they want it to go. And there's a reason for that. So let's ask a couple of questions now. Why will the Iranian regime survive when there was so much confidence a few months ago that it was going to fall? Well, first of all, you need to understand a little about the Iranian regime. This is an article from the Times of Israel. The Iranian regime are preparing the way for the 12th Imam, or the Mahdi, as they believe. Basically, they believe that if they create chaos in the world, it's going to accelerate the return of kind of like the Islamic version of the Messiah. Specifically, the founder of the Islamic Revolution, Ayatollah Khamenei, he declared that the Iranian government specifically was the vanguard of the Mahdi, the one agency that would accelerate the return to the earth of the Islamic Messiah. So this is not politics as far as they're concerned. This is their religion. And it's very difficult to reason and negotiate with people who are thinking like that, as Mr. Trump and the Americans and the Israelis are finding out. But I want you to bear in mind a fundamental biblical principle that isn't being factored into the thinking of these world leaders, because they don't believe in God and they certainly don't read the scriptures and they certainly don't understand Bible prophecies. In ancient times, the prophet Daniel recorded these words in Daniel chapter 4, verse 17. And these are the times when the greatest superpower in the world was the Babylonian power under King Nebuchadnezzar. But there's a very crucial verse in Daniel 4 that says this: "This matter is by the decree of the watchers and the demand by the word of the holy ones, to the intent that the living may know that the Most High ruleth in the kingdom of men, and giveth it to whomsoever he will, and setteth up over it the basest of men." So this verse is telling us a crucial secret here. God is in control, and he puts leaders in charge of countries. Some of them are the worst type of people you could possibly have as world leaders. Now, why would God do this? Well, it's because God is going to use them to advance his plan. So therefore, from a Bible point of view, good and bad world leaders are both used by God to advance his divine agenda. So why is Russia then going to win?
Thanks for staying with us for this report. We pray that the video report has provided some clarity to the situation in the Middle East. We encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel and select all so you never miss a new upload. Don't forget to like, share and drop a comment in the comment section. We love to hear your thoughts. Make sure you follow our playlist and never miss a new report. Until next time, God willing, this has been the Watchman Report, bringing perspective to current world news from a biblical standpoint. Don't forget to hit that like button. It really helps the channel grow. Drop a comment in the comment section and let us know what you thought, and make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new upload. Please share it and spread the word. Thanks for watching, and remember to come back soon.